pen felt heavier than it should have. Veronica Stanhope had held drafting pencils for 15 years, had signed off on multi-million-dollar blueprints, without her hand trembling once. But that morning, in the offices of Whitman and Associates on Bay Street in Toronto, her fingers wouldn't stop shaking. The notary said nothing. He just waited. And Veronica pressed the nib to the paper and signed her name to the end of her marriage. Outside, sleet tapped against the floor-to-ceiling windows. November in Toronto had a particular cruelty to it. Not the dramatic cold of January, but something meaner. Something wet and gray that got into your coat and stayed there. She noticed that. She noticed the sleet. She noticed the notary's cufflinks were slightly mismatched. She noticed everything except the sound her own breath was making, which had gone shallow without her realizing. Griffin Stanhope, her husband of 6 years, the man who had proposed to her on a hiking trail in Algonquin Park, while her boots were soaked through, was not in the room. He'd had his lawyer sign as proxy. That detail landed somewhere quiet and deep in her chest and stayed there. She slid the papers back across the mahogany table. "That's everything," the notary said. She picked up her bag and walked out. The first person to know wasn't her mother, or her best friend Claudette, or anyone she'd expected to call. It was a stranger, a woman named Bev, who ran the coffee cart on the corner of King and Spadina, who took one look at Veronica standing in the sleet without an umbrella and said, "Honey, you want your usual, or do you want something stronger?" Veronica laughed. Actually laughed. "Is there a latte that tastes like the last 6 years didn't happen?" Bev handed her a double-shot Americano, on the house. She stood at that cart for 20 minutes. She didn't call anyone. She just drank her coffee and watched the streetcars go by and told herself she was fine. She was 37 years old. She was a senior architect at one of the most respected firms in the country, and she was fine. She was not fine. She found out 3 weeks later in a clinic on Bloor Street, under fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly, with a paper gown crinkling every time she shifted on the examination table. Dr. Amara Osipaku had a careful way of delivering news. Not cold, not warm, but exact. The kind of precision that left no room for mishearing. "You're pregnant," she said. "And based on what I'm seeing here," she turned the monitor toward Veronica, "it looks like twins." Veronica stared at the screen for a long time. "Twins," she repeated. "2 strong heartbeats. You're approximately 9 weeks along." 9 weeks, which meant she did the arithmetic without wanting to. The pregnancy had already existed when she'd signed those papers. It had already existed when Griffin's lawyer had signed as proxy. It had already existed when Griffin had sent her a text 2 days after she'd moved out, saying, "I think we both knew this wasn't working," which was a sentence she had read 17 times and still couldn't fully believe a real person had written to another real person they had once loved. She didn't tell him right away. That was a decision she would revisit many times in the months that followed, in the specific way you revisit decisions made while in shock. Not with regret exactly, but with a kind of bewildered tenderness for the person you were when you made them. She was 9 weeks pregnant, newly divorced, living in a furnished rental in Leslieville, and she needed approximately 48 hours to sit with the information before she could figure out what shape it was. She told him on a Wednesday. She called because a text felt wrong. He picked up on the 3rd ring, and she could hear in the background the ambient noise of somewhere nice. Glasses clinking, low music, voices at a remove. Veronica. Not Ronnie, which is what he had always called her. Veronica. Already a stranger's formality. "I'm pregnant," she said. "It's twins. I found out last week." A silence. Long enough that she counted it. "I'm going to need some time to process that," he said finally. She said okay. She hung up. She sat on the floor of her rental apartment with her back against the couch and looked at the ceiling for a very long time. Griffin called back 4 days later. He wanted to meet. She agreed, thinking, hoping, if she was honest, that parenthood might reorganize something in him, might reroute whatever had driven him so far away from her in the last year of their marriage that she'd barely recognized him. She got dressed carefully that morning. She wore the gray wool coat he'd always liked. He brought his lawyer. That was how she found out he'd already consulted one. The lawyer's name was Donahue, and he had the practiced neutrality of someone who delivered difficult information for a living. He spoke about the situation and appropriate arrangements and the complexity of the timing, and what it amounted to was this. Griffin was prepared to offer her a settlement, a number she was not to discuss publicly, a non-disclosure agreement attached, in exchange for a clean separation of any claims going forward. The pregnancy would be addressed separately, by which Donahue meant Griffin wanted a paternity arrangement that was clearly delineated and managed. Managed. She looked at Griffin across the table. He was looking at the surface in front of him. "I'm carrying your children," she said, not loudly. Just as a fact, he didn't answer. She stood up, put on her gray wool coat, and walked out for the second time in a month. She did not sign Donahue's papers. That at least she got right. The pregnancy was not easy. She had expected that. What she hadn't expected was the specific quality of managing it alone, the prenatal appointments where the intake forms asked for partner's name, and she left the line blank, the 2 a.m. Stretches of insomnia where she lay in the dark of her rental and tried to do the math of what 2 children on a single income in Toronto actually looked like. The nausea that hit her on a Tuesday afternoon in the middle of a client presentation, and she had to excuse herself and breathe against the wall of the women's bathroom for 3 minutes before going back in. She did not take the settlement. She did consult a lawyer, her own, a woman named Brenda Choi, who had a sharp mind and a blunt manner, and who spent 40 minutes telling Veronica in clear and unambiguous terms exactly what she should have negotiated before she signed the divorce papers. "You signed without a financial agreement in place," Brenda said. "I know. While carrying his children, I know." Brenda gave her a look that contained an entire opinion she was too professional to voice. "We can still pursue support. The NDA he's proposing, don't sign it. Don't sign anything from his team without running it by me first." Veronica didn't sign the NDA. She moved twice in 4 months. The Leslieville rental was too expensive. Then the Parkdale sublet fell through and eventually landed in a 2-bedroom in East York that she could actually afford, on a street with a good elementary school 3 blocks away, which she noted because she was already thinking like that, already mapping a future around 2 people who weren't born yet. She met Patrick Nowak in her building's laundry room in February. That was the kind of sentence that sounded ridiculous, and she knew it. She was 6 months pregnant, carrying a laundry basket that had gotten awkward to hold, trying to negotiate the combination lock on the machine closest to the door. He appeared, her neighbor from the 3rd floor, as it turned out, and held the door for her without making a production of it, without the elaborate "let me help you," with that energy that she'd been getting from strangers since her belly had become visible. He just held the door. She nodded thanks. He started his own laundry. They talked for 40 minutes that first time, standing between the machines while the dryers ran, about nothing particularly meaningful. The building's temperamental boiler, whether the Vietnamese place on Coxwell had declined, or whether their standards had just shifted, the complete impossibility of parallel parking on their street in winter. He was an engineer. He taught part-time at Ryerson. She still called it that, though the signage had changed. He'd moved into the building 8 months ago after a contract in Vancouver ended. He was quiet in the way that meant he was actually listening, which she'd started to notice as a rare quality. He didn't ask about the pregnancy. Not in that first conversation, not in the second, not when he helped her carry groceries up the stairs in March without being asked. He didn't pry. He didn't perform concern. He just was there in the ordinary way that turned out to mean something. She went into labor on a Sunday morning in April, 7 weeks early, which her doctor had said might happen with twins, and which she had nodded at sensibly, while privately hoping would not. She had a plan. The plan involved her friend Claudette, who lived in Scarborough and had promised to be on call. Claudette's phone went straight to voicemail. Her mother was in Victoria visiting her sister and had a connecting flight that couldn't be moved. The cab she called had a 15-minute wait, which felt very long, standing in the hallway of her building holding the wall. Patrick came out of the elevator with a gym bag and stopped. He looked at her. She looked at him. "I'm fine," she said, which was not quite true. "Do you need a ride to the hospital?" She wanted to say no. She was already tallying reasons why she shouldn't accept. They barely knew each other. It was Sunday, she could wait for the cab, she was going to be fine. But the next contraction arrived before she finished the thought, and she heard herself say, "Yes, please." He drove her to Michael Guerin in his 10-year-old Subaru. He didn't say much. He just drove, and when she gripped the door handle through a contraction, he didn't look over or comment. He parked in the emergency bay and helped her inside, and then, when the triage nurse took her information, he sat in the waiting area because she hadn't told him he could leave, and he hadn't assumed. She had her daughters, both of them, Freya and Nell, at 4:17 and 4:22 that afternoon, both small, both determined, both screaming within seconds. The nurse put them on her chest and she held them, one in each arm, and felt something shift in her so completely that she couldn't have described it even then, even in the middle of it. It wasn't joy exactly, though it was that too. It was more like recognition, like meeting people she'd already been waiting for. Patrick was still in the waiting room when a nurse went out at 6 p.m. to ask if anyone was waiting for Veronica Stanhope. He came in, and she was propped up in the hospital bed with a daughter asleep in each arm, and he stood at the door looking at the three of them, with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Both healthy?" he asked. "Both perfect," she said. He pulled a chair to the side of the room and sat down, and they talked quietly for an hour while her daughters slept. Later she would think of it as the first conversation they had, where she stopped keeping count of what she owed him. Griffin found out about the birth through a mutual friend, which was nobody's fault. "These things move," he called. She answered, because the girls deserved to have her answer. He said the right things, the things that sound like the right things, about wanting to be involved, about wanting to do right by them. She listened. She told him to contact Brenda Choi. What followed was a year of exactly the kind of thing Brenda had warned her about. His legal team moved slowly when it suited them. Support payments were delayed, then disputed, then recalculated in ways that required more filings. She went to work every morning. Her firm had been good about leave, better than she'd expected, and came home to Freya and Nell and the rotating chaos of twin infancy. And on Thursdays, Patrick came over for dinner, because it had started as a favor, him bringing food when she'd been in a particularly brutal stretch, and had gradually become a fixture without either of them formally deciding it was. She did not tell people they were together, because for a long time they weren't, not exactly. He was her neighbor, and then her friend, and then the person she talked to at the end of difficult days, and then something she didn't have a clean word for. He did not push for a word. He showed up and was useful and made her laugh, and listened to her think out loud about the legal proceedings, with the patience of someone who had no stake in it except that it mattered to her, which turned out to be enough of a stake. What she didn't expect was Griffin circling back. 18 months after Freya and Nell were born, after a year of delayed payments and strategic legal slowness, Griffin Stanhope decided he wanted to be more involved. That was how his new lawyer framed it, more involved, as though his prior involvement had simply been modest rather than absent. He was filing for formal custody arrangements. He wanted scheduled time with his daughters. His daughters, who he had met twice. Brenda called her on a Tuesday and delivered this news with the same precision she delivered everything. Veronica was at her desk at the firm when the call came in. She said okay several times. She wrote things down. After she hung up, she sat for a moment looking at the city through the window. The lake visible from the right angle, glittering in the February light. And then she went back to her drafting software and worked until 5 o'clock, because Freya and Nell were at daycare until 5, and there was nothing she could do from her desk except work. She told Patrick that night. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "What do you need? Not what are you going to do? Not he can't do that. Just what do you need?" She had started to understand by then that this was the thing about him that was different from most people. He went straight to the useful question. "I need this to go through the courts and be finished," she said. "I need a formal order. I need him to have legal obligations, not just intentions." "Then that's what you go for." Brenda, it turned out, had been building toward this. The year of delayed payments and disputed calculations had generated a paper trail with a particular logic. Griffin's team had assumed they were negotiating from strength, but Brenda had been documenting every delay, every recalculation, every month where the payment arrived late or short. She had dates, she had amounts, she had correspondence that demonstrated a pattern. "He filed because he wants to look like an engaged father," Brenda said. "That's fine. We'll let him make that argument. And then we'll show the court what the last 18 months actually looked like." The hearing was in March, on a morning when Toronto was doing its annual trick of being cold and bright at the same time, the kind of day that looked warmer than it was. Veronica wore a dark blazer and the small diamond studs her mother had given her after the divorce, which had felt like an act of quiet solidarity at the time, and still did. She sat across from Griffin in a room that smelled like paper and central heating, and for the first time in almost 2 years, she looked at him directly. He looked the same. That was strange, somehow. He looked completely the same. Griffin's lawyer presented the case for expanded involvement. It was competently done. He spoke about Griffin's financial stability, his professional standing, his desire to be present in his daughters' lives going forward. He used the word going forward 8 times. Veronica counted. Then Brenda spoke. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't editorialize. She simply walked through the record, month by month, payment by payment, documented communication by documented communication, and let the pattern speak for itself. The 2 visits in 18 months. The support amount that had required 4 separate legal exchanges to establish and had still arrived incomplete on 3 occasions. The NDA that had been presented to Veronica while she was pregnant, before any formal support arrangement existed. The proxy signature on the divorce papers, while Veronica was unknowingly 9 weeks along. The judge was a woman named Justice Calendar, with reading glasses on a chain and an expression of disciplined neutrality that Veronica found oddly reassuring. She asked several questions. Griffin's lawyer answered them. Brenda answered 2 follow-ups. When it was over, not immediately, these things take time, take weeks of subsequent filings and waiting, and a final order that arrived by email on a Thursday afternoon. The arrangement was clear: formal support, specific and binding. Supervised access while a relationship with the girls was established, meaning he would need to do the actual work of becoming known to them before any expanded custody was considered. No NDA, nothing silenced. Veronica sat in Brenda's office and read the order twice. Then she folded it and put it in her bag. "That's as good as it gets," Brenda said. "I know," Veronica said. "Thank you." She walked out into the March afternoon and called her mother, who cried a little, and then called Claudette, who did not cry but said several things about Griffin Stanhope that were satisfying to hear. Then she texted Patrick. "It's done. Come over for dinner?" He replied with a single word: "Already shopping." The conversation about what they were happened on a Saturday in May, on the back deck of her East York apartment building, after Freya and Nell had gone to sleep. It was warm enough finally, that particular Toronto warmth that feels earned after winter, and they had a bottle of something cheap and decent between them, and the city was doing its evening thing in the distance. He said, "I'd like to stop pretending I'm just your neighbor." She looked at the city for a moment. "You've been more than my neighbor for a long time." "I know. I just thought you should say it when you were ready." She turned and looked at him. This quiet, careful man, who had driven her to the hospital in his 10-year-old Subaru and sat in the waiting room for hours and asked, "What do you need?" every time, instead of telling her what she should do. She thought about the version of herself from 3 years ago, sitting on the floor of a Leslieville rental with her back against the couch, looking at the ceiling. That woman couldn't have mapped a path to here. But here was where she'd ended up. "I'm ready," she said. It wasn't a grand declaration. It didn't need to be. He reached over and took her hand, and they sat there in the warm evening while the city hummed below them. Freya and Nell turned 2 that April. They had a party in the backyard. A small thing. Neighborhood families. Claudette driving in from Scarborough. Veronica's mother flying out from Victoria. A cake that got enthusiastically destroyed within minutes of being presented. Patrick stood at the edge of the yard, watching the chaos with the expression he sometimes got. This particular look of quiet contentment that she'd learned to recognize as happiness with him, because he wasn't a person who performed it. Later, when the guests had trickled out and the girls were napping, and the yard was in the gentle disarray of a good party, Veronica sat on the back step and looked at the garden she'd been slowly planting. Tomatoes, herbs, some stubborn roses she'd inherited from the previous tenant. She'd learned to garden here, in this city, in this strange and entirely unplanned life. Griffin had applied for the first supervised visit the previous month. The visit had lasted 2 hours and had been, by all accounts, polite and awkward, and exactly as strained as you would expect between a father and daughters who were meeting him for only the third time. She did not have feelings about this that were clean or simple. She had feelings that were complicated and human and sometimes contradictory, and she had learned to let them be that without requiring them to resolve. What she knew, clearly and without ambivalence, was this. Freya and Nell had a mother who was present, a home that was stable, a man downstairs who fixed things when they broke and read them stories, and had learned, painstakingly, their separate opinions about which stuffed animals ranked highest in the hierarchy of importance. They had Claudette, who brought gifts slightly too loud and age-inappropriate and with great love. They had a grandmother who called every Sunday. They were okay. More than okay. Veronica Stanhope had signed a piece of paper in a lawyer's office in November 3 years ago, in the rain, with her hand shaking. She'd stood at a coffee cart afterward and told herself she was fine. She hadn't been fine then, but she was now. Not because anything dramatic had rescued her. No single moment of reversal. No spectacular collapse of the person who had wronged her. Just time and work and the ordinary accumulation of a life that turned out to be larger and richer than the one she'd thought she was losing. The tomatoes were coming in. She could hear Nell beginning to stir upstairs, her specific waking up sounds starting low and escalating in the way Veronica had learned to read like a language. She stood up, brushed the soil from her hands, and went inside.